The third time the keypad blinked red and spat out "access denied," I didn't flinch, not even a little. I just exhaled, long and low, like a man who had been waiting for this moment all year. From the intercom mounted on the polished iron gate, a sharp voice cut through the quiet morning. "This is Crestpine Community Property. You're trespassing. Please vacate." I recognized the voice immediately. It was Amanda Langford, PO8 president, real estate agent, self-proclaimed savior of neighborhood order. And standing beside her was a crowd of well-groomed residents in pastel polos and pressed khakis, watching me like a zoo exhibit. But I didn't argue. I didn't protest. Instead, I reached behind the passenger seat of my truck, unlatched a small cedar box, and ran my fingers across the smooth lid. 6 months of planning had led to this moment. The gate in front of me, it wasn't just theirs. It was mine, too. Let me tell you how we got here. It started one bitter October morning. I was out repairing a sagging section of the back fence line on my property, an 8-gate ranch tucked into the hills north of Bozeman, Montana. My wife, Clara, and I had bought the place 10 years earlier, when we left behind Seattle tech life for something real, something quiet. She called it our forever, a space to breathe, to grow old. She died 3 years later. Breast cancer doesn't care about your plans. That land became my anchor after she was gone, fixing fences, raising goats, watching the sun melt behind pine ridges. It was the only rhythm that made sense anymore. The problem started with a ding from my phone. I wiped my hands on my jeans and read the subject line: "Important new community access regulations." I opened the email and felt a knot form in my chest. The message was from the Crestpine HOA, the new neighborhood that had popped up over the past 5 years on the edge of my land. Cookie-cutter homes in soft gray paint, white vinyl fences, and zero personality. People moved in like they were collecting HOA points. The email explained that, for security and property value optimization, Crestpine was installing a gate system on the only road in and out of my ranch. No mention of my access, no request for input, just a declarative, "This is happening." Now, here's the thing. This road? It looked like it belonged to Crestpine. They'd paved it, maintained it, but if you followed the original deed lines, and I had, that road was carved out of my property. It wasn't just mine by spirit. It was mine by law. Clara and I had double-checked every boundary marker when we signed the dotted line. Still, I needed backup. So I called Thomas "Tommy" Brooks, my neighbor 2 parcels down. Ex-fire chief. Grizzled, blunt, and trustworthy. We sat on my porch, sipping lukewarm beers and staring at the mountain line. "This isn't about a gate," he muttered. "This is about squeezing you out." He told me he'd heard rumors about a commercial development, something big. A resort, maybe, or a country club. And guess whose land? They'd need to finish the expansion. That's right, mine. Amanda had never liked me. She said my barn was a visual disturbance. My rooster crowed too early. My vegetable garden didn't match the neighborhood vibe. When Clara died, she sent a sympathy card with a brochure for lawn care. I never forgot that. Tommy leaned back in his chair. "You gotta go to that meeting, man. See what they're planning." The following Thursday, I walked into the Crestpine Community Hall for the first time. People stared like I'd walked into the wrong church. Amanda, perfectly styled in her navy blazer and ivory heels, barely concealed her distaste. Mr. Warren, she said, as if chewing on the name. How nice of you to join us. The meeting was about enhancing security. Amanda clicked through slides of smiling families and ornamental gates. Every resident will be issued smart access cards. Visitors will register online. Deliveries scheduled. Safety is our priority. I raised my hand. And what about the road? That's private property, by my deed. Has your legal team accounted for that? Her eyes narrowed, but her smile didn't budge. Our consultants have reviewed the original plans. The access road falls under community governance. She moved on before I could reply. But I wasn't done. At the end of the meeting, I lingered. That's when I saw him. Grant Bishop. Navy suit, perfect tan, talking to Amanda in hushed tones. The name tag on his jacket read Northfield Realty Development. I followed the conversation just long enough to hear the words Phase 2, Removal Timeline, and Easement Mitigation. I went home and didn't sleep. I dug out the original deed, Clara's notes, everything. At 3 a.m., I found it. A clause from 1972, tucked into the property history. Easement retained by owner in perpetuity. No modification permitted without owner's signed approval. I called Andrea Lee, a local real estate attorney Clara had known. She read the documents twice. You don't just own the road, she said, pointing at the highlighted passage. You control the only access point to their entire community. I didn't blink, and that's when we started building the trap. Over the next months, I smiled when Amanda waved from her Lexus. I nodded politely at HOA meetings. I even donated to their gate beautification fund, all while documenting every overstep, every change, every comment. All while installing hidden boundary markers, filing quiet paperwork with the county clerk, and preparing a legal net so tight Amanda wouldn't know she'd walked into it until it was too late. And now, here I was. 6 months later, the gate installed, my access revoked. Amanda's voice still hung in the air. Please vacate. I opened the cedar box in my truck. Inside was a single sheet of paper, signed, notarized and filed with the county. And on the back of that page, scrawled in Clara's handwriting from years ago, were 7 simple words. Don't back down. This land is ours. I smiled, and I stepped out of the truck. The wind shifted as I stepped toward the gate, that ridiculous monument of forged iron and inflated egos. A few neighbors clustered near the entrance, watching me, whispering. Amanda stood front and center, arms crossed like a warden at roll call, her silk scarf fluttering behind her like a victory flag. But this wasn't her victory. I held the document in my hand. Cool, thick stock with a county seal pressed into its corner, and watched her eyes narrow as I approached. Mr. Warren, she said crisply, you're advised to leave. I didn't raise my voice, didn't look left or right. I simply said, you've built a gate on a road you don't own. Her smile faltered for the briefest second. I handed her the paper. This is a certified statement from Gallatin County confirming the historic easement, which grants me not only the right to access, but also full control over modifications to this stretch of road. That includes the gate. She didn't take the paper, just stared at it like it might burn her fingers. Behind her, someone murmured, "Wait, is that true?" "I'll be filing a formal injunction in the morning," I continued, "and I've already spoken to the inspector about the electrical work. You skipped a lot of permits, Amanda. That gate, it's not just illegal, it's coming down." For a long beat, no one moved. Then Amanda reached for the paper with a tight, jerky motion, snatching it as though she could erase the ink by sheer force of will. "This is absurd," she hissed. "We had legal review. We have attorneys." I shrugged. "So do I." I walked away. That night, I sat on the back porch, sipping black coffee out of Clara's favorite mug, the one with the faded sketch of a goat and the words, "Yes, we heard." The stars above the ridge blinked into place one by one as I listened to the rustle of wind through pine. I could almost hear Clara's voice beside me, low and amused. "About damn time, Daniel." The next morning, I drove to Andrea Lee's office. She was already waiting, documents organized, calm as always. "It's not just about you anymore," she said, tapping the manila folder. "Turns out, Vericon, those developers, filed pre-permits with the state. They're planning a retail and commercial strip that cuts directly across your property." She pulled out a glossy brochure. Crestpine Commons, it read in gold serif letters. Trees, fake lakes, a wine bar, upscale parking. The overlay map showed a road running straight through my pasture and into what they'd labeled a future development zone, which was, of course, my home. "They never intended to negotiate," Andrea said. "They were going to pressure you until you sold or broke. Everything Amanda's done. The gate, the card restrictions, the surveillance reports, that was phase 1 of the squeeze." My stomach clenched. "They want the ranch." "They always did." Andrea nodded. "And now, we make sure they don't. Get it?" Over the following weeks, we built our case like craftsmen framing a house. Every harassment attempt, every meeting minute where Amanda casually referenced removal of obstacles, every security incident was cataloged and time-stamped. Tommy helped install more trail cams. Andrea filed a quiet property clarification with the zoning board. And I made sure to attend every single HOA meeting with a calm, neutral smile. Let them believe I'd given up. Let him relax. The gate went live 2 weeks later. New metal, fresh wiring, that smug Crestpine logo etched into the side. Amanda handed out access cards at a distribution event that looked more like a champagne gala than a community upgrade. I watched her from a distance, laughing with developers and posing for photos. She gave me one card. One. And she smiled while she did it. "Special permissions are required for agricultural vehicles," she said sweetly, "to preserve road quality." I said thank you, I didn't blink, and I walked away. But behind the scenes, we were ready. The very next day, a delivery truck carrying fence posts was turned away at the gate. The following morning, my tractor triggered the gate alarm, locking me out until a patrol officer reviewed my credentials. When I asked Amanda for clarification, she referred me to the Community Compliance Division, which, as far as I could tell, was a Gmail account with no reply function. Then came the kicker. I got a certified letter. Inside was a formal offer to purchase my land 30% below market value, with a note signed by Amanda suggesting it would be in everyone's best interest if I accepted, as resistance to community progress could result in increased access complications. I brought the letter to Andrea. She read it twice, looked up, and smiled. "We've got them." That night, I went to Tommy's garage. We sat under a buzzing overhead bulb, surrounded by toolboxes and chicken feed bags. I showed him the gate logs, the denial reports, the offer. "This is it," I said. "We spring it next week." Tommy grinned and cracked open 2 beers. "Let's make it hurt." On the morning of the emergency HOA board meeting, I wore my nicest jeans and the boots Clara gave me for our first anniversary. Andrea carried the documents. Tommy brought the cameras. Amanda tried to open the meeting with her usual tight-lipped control. "We're here to discuss ongoing access issues. I interrupt. Before we begin, I'd like to present documentation confirming that the access road in question lies entirely on private property, mine, and that the gate was installed without legal permission, without county approval, and in violation of multiple zoning ordinances. I slid the map across the table. Silence. And then Andrea added, "This packet also includes recordings of conversations between Mrs. Langford and Mr. Bishop of Vercon Development, indicating premeditated pressure tactics to force a sale, including threats, economic restrictions, and use of HOA funds for unlawful infrastructure." Someone in the room gasped. Amanda stood up. "You can't do this." Andrea's tone didn't change. "Oh, but we are." That was the day the trap closed. The day Amanda realized she hadn't just built a gate, she'd built her own gallows. The morning after the board meeting, Amanda's gate stood wide open, but not by choice. The county inspector had arrived at 7:30 sharp, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp and skeptical. 2 sheriff's deputies flanked him as they examined the structure with growing concern. Wiring exposed. No inspection stickers. No posted permits. And worst of all, the entire foundation embedded on a stretch of road, now indisputably marked private property. Warren Ranch easement. Amanda showed up 20 minutes late, clearly unaware of how fast the tide had turned. She stepped out of her SUV in designer heels and a tailored trench coat, trying to maintain control with every click across the gravel. "This is a secure community installation," she declared, holding her phone up like a badge. "You have no right to dismantle." "You're mistaken, ma'am," the inspector replied coolly, handing her a printed notice. "This structure violates 3 county ordinances and lacks proper zoning approval. Effective immediately, this gate must cease operation until compliance is achieved." Amanda's face drained of color. "And you?" the deputy added, turning to me. "Mr. Warren, retain full access rights to this road. Which means you can open or close it at your discretion." I nodded once. Calm. Collected. Just like Clara used to say. Don't gloat. Let the silence do the talking. That silence stretched long as Amanda scanned the document in disbelief. Her voice trembled when she finally whispered, "This isn't over." She was right about that, but not in the way she thought. Because that afternoon, everything unraveled. Andrea had timed the release perfectly. She delivered digital copies of the legal complaint, easement documentation, and board meeting transcripts to every resident of Oak Hollow. Each email opened with the same line: "You deserve to know what your HOA has been doing in your name." The effect was immediate. Emails lit up. Phones rang. The community message board, usually reserved for garage sale flyers and lost cat alerts, exploded with furious threads titled "HOA Corruption" and "Illegal Gate Built with Our Money." By 5 p.m., Amanda was cornered in the community garden by 3 longtime residents and 1 extremely irate father, whose Amazon delivery had been delayed because of tractor traffic issues. But the real blow landed the next morning. The newspaper. Front page, black bold headline: "Local hoeing accused of trespassing, gate scandal, and coercive property tactics." Beneath it was a photo of me at the open gate, arms folded, with Andrea standing beside me, holding a stack of legal files. A man's name was all over the article, along with Greg Bishop from Vercon. The article even included snippets from the HOA's secret meeting minutes. "Accelerate timeline" and "Apply indirect pressure until sale is negotiated." It was all out in the open now. Vercon, in damage control mode, issued a bland public statement. We were unaware of certain legal complications. But behind the scenes, Greg was livid. A contact of mine at the county office said he'd shown up shouting, waving blueprints, threatening lawsuits that would bury this hick rancher in paperwork. Too late, Greg. It's just before sunset. Andrea handed me a text from the county commissioner's office. Permit denied. Vericon's entire development plan had been rejected on grounds of unresolved access rights and community objection. Amanda didn't show up to the emergency HOA meeting that evening. Greg didn't either. But nearly everyone else did. Andrea stood up before the crowd and read a short statement. The Warren Ranch is not for sale. The road belongs to Mr. Warren, and it will remain open for respectful community access, subject to reasonable agreements, not threats, not manipulation, followed with just one sentence. I came here to build a life with my wife, not fight a war. Bellable David, but I'll never let anyone take what we built together. The applause was deafening. I stepped down from the podium and shook hands with neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years. One woman hugged me. Another man apologized for ever doubting my side of the story. And when Robert Williams, gravel-voiced, and still wearing his old Marine cap, stood up to propose a vote of no confidence in Amanda Langford's leadership, the ayes were unanimous. By the end of that week, Amanda had officially resigned. Her carefully curated life, her power, her leverage, her legacy, collapsed in one swift, silent vote. Greg Bishop, rumors said he left town. Vericon pulled out of the county entirely, and the gate removed, every bolt and panel hauled away like the ruins of a failed empire. We replaced it with a modest wooden arch. A small sign beneath it read, "Welcome to Oak Hollow, all neighbors, no bullies." The final chapter hadn't been written yet, but I knew this. Clara would have smiled at how it ended. She always believed in letting people find their better selves, even when they forgot who they were. And as I sat back on our porch, coffee warming my hands and the sun turning the hills to fire, I knew the ranch wasn't just safe. It was finally home again. The day after Amanda's resignation, Oak Hollow was quieter than it had been in months. Not the silence of suppression or tension, but the kind that settles over a place that just exhaled. You could feel it in the air. People walked a little slower. They smiled a little easier. Kids played soccer in the park again, their laughter replacing the murmurs of fear and frustration that had haunted the neighborhood during Amanda's reign. But beneath that calm, I knew we weren't done. Power vacuums attract opportunists. And while Amanda was gone, the board she'd molded was still in place, still operating under policies she'd crafted and alliances she'd built, like a snake without its head, but whose body hadn't yet realized it was dead. So when Robert Williams asked me to attend the special HOA transition meeting as a guest advisor, I didn't hesitate. That Thursday night, I walked into the same community center where I'd once sat alone in the back row, ignored, dismissed. This time, I was greeted with nods, firm handshakes, even applause. The long wooden table at the front, once Amanda's stage, now bore a different tone. There were no smug smirks or veiled threats tonight, just paper coffee cups, tired eyes, and a heavy sense of responsibility. Robert cleared his throat. "We're here to rebuild," he said simply. "Not just board, but trust." Then he turned to me. "Ethan, would you mind sharing what you'd like to see happen?" I stood, the creak of the old chair echoing slightly, and let my eyes sweep the room. "I don't want power," I began. "I want fairness. I want to wake up in the morning and know that no one's trying to force me out of my home. And I want every single person in this community to feel the same way. I held up a folded document, the proposal Andrea and I had spent nights perfecting. A trust, a legal, transparent, community trust that governs the access road jointly. Equal say, equal responsibility, with stipulations in place to protect the ranch and the integrity of this land for good. I could see some of them exchange cautious glances. Then Robert reached forward, unfolded the document, and began reading. By the end, the vote was unanimous. The Warren Ranch Access Trust was born that night, inked with signatures and sealed with relief. But the work didn't stop there. Andrea helped the board audit its financials. What we found made stomachs turn. Maintenance funds, backroom deals with Vericon, even personal reimbursements Amanda had signed off on. The board members who had quietly supported her began resigning one by one. And in their place, neighbors stood up, people who had been silent too long, but were now ready to build something better. That weekend, we held the first true community event in over a year. Not a wine and cheese gala with name tags and HOA speeches. This was a potluck picnic at the Warren Ranch. Long tables set under string lights, barbecue pits smoking, kids running wild between hay bales. The kind of event where you remembered why you moved somewhere like Oak Hollow in the first place. I watched from the porch, sipping sweet tea, the dog curled up at my feet. For a long time, I'd thought this place had been broken by power, but now I could see it had only been buried. And all it needed was the right moment, the right fight, to rise back up. Midway through the evening, Andrea joined me on the steps. She handed me a plate stacked with cornbread and ribs and sat beside me. "Did you ever think this would happen?" she asked. I laughed, slow and deep. "Not in a million years. But Clara would have." Andrea nodded. She'd be proud. We sat in silence for a moment, watching Robert help a group of kids untangle their kite string from a fence post. The man had found new purpose. Same as me. Later that night, after the last lantern had gone out and the fire pit had dwindled to embers, I walked the gravel path down to where the gate used to be. In its place was a hand-painted sign that read, "Welcome. If you're here to help, stay. If you're here to take, turn around." I touched the wood, tracing the letters Clara and I had once joked about painting for our front porch. It had taken a war to finally hang them. The land was quiet again, the hills breathing slow, the stars blinking overhead like old friends nodding approval. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like the story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to all of us now. The residents who had spoken up, to the board members who had stepped down, to Robert, to Andrea, to the neighbors who had stopped being strangers. It belonged to Oak Hollow, rebuilt, not with gates and rules, but with resilience and a hell of a lot of truth. And tomorrow would start planting that community garden Clara always wanted. 3 months passed. The garden at the edge of the Warren Ranch bloomed in rows of colors Clara would have adored. Sunflowers tall and defiant, lavender waving in the wind, tomato vines creeping confidently up trellises we'd built from salvaged wood. It wasn't much, but it was alive, and so were we. Every Sunday, the gate that had once symbolized exclusion now welcomed families, laughter, the clinking of mason jars filled with iced tea and lemonade. The community we'd rebuilt didn't just feel different. It was different. There was music, potlucks, community meetings that actually meant something. You could smell the smoke from grills and hear kids running through open fields where they'd once been told to keep out. And I got my life back. Not the same life I had with Clara. That chapter would always remain sacred. But I had found purpose in a way I never expected. By standing up, by fighting smart, and by proving that sometimes the smallest patch of land, if fought for, can hold back an empire. Greg Johnson from Bearcon didn't go quietly. He tried pulling legal strings, claimed breach of goodwill, even suggested suing the new board for obstruction. But the evidence we compiled, recordings, emails, the financial ties between him and Amanda hit like thunder. The county denied their rezoning request. The investors, they fled like rats from a sinking ship. The final blow came when Vericon was slapped with an investigation into unethical land acquisition across 3 counties. Greg resigned. Their project was dead in the water. And Amanda? She moved to another town. No goodbye, no press release. Just gone. Like a bad storm that leaves broken fences and muddy footprints, but can't erase the roots beneath. Robert remained interim HOA president for a while before the community voted in a full board, this time publicly, transparently, with candidates running on platforms like protecting heritage, sustainable planning, and accessibility for all. Not exactly the kind of slogans that sell condos, but the ones that meant something. Andrea stayed too. She opened her own firm, small, local, but powerful. People called her when HOAs got too bold, or developers started sniffing around with dollar signs in their eyes. And when I finally gave her a key to the ranch gate, she didn't say anything, just smiled. But what truly changed wasn't a document or a piece of legislation. It was something quieter, subtler. You could see it in the way neighbors spoke to each other, in the way kids rode their bikes across the now public trail that bordered my ranch. In the hand-painted signs it said, "Welcome, neighbor," instead of "private property." Clara once told me that legacy wasn't what you left behind, it was what you passed forward while you were still here. And I understood that now, because this land didn't just belong to me anymore. It belonged to everyone who fought for it, who stood up, who paid attention, who said enough when the powerful thought they could take and take until there was nothing left. It belonged to the old man who cried when he found out his HOA fees had gone into Amanda's pockets. It belonged to the single mom who said her kid slept easier now, without the gate, casting a shadow over their driveway. It belonged to the girl who planted strawberries in our garden and asked if she could name the scarecrow Clara. And it still belonged to me. Not because I held the deed, but because I held the memory, the dream Clara and I built. That fall, we held the first ever Oak Hollow Harvest Festival. It wasn't much, a few booths, live music from the local high school, hay rides and cider and too many pies. But when I looked out over the crowd, saw Andrea leaning against the porch railing, Robert helping an old couple find seats, and the scarecrow standing proudly in the garden, well, I knew. We didn't just win, we healed. And so, if you've made it this far in the story, if you've stuck with me through every twist, every injustice, every quietly planned counterattack, I want you to remember this. You're not powerless. Sometimes the strongest walls are built by hand. Sometimes the best justice isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming what should never have been threatened. And sometimes The gate they build to keep you out becomes the very doorway to something greater than they ever imagined. So if you've ever been pushed around by a board, a company, or a person who thought they could play God over your life, stand up. Push back. And when you do, plant something in their place. If you like this story, comment 1 below. If not, comment 0 and tell me how I can make the next one better, because these stories, they're yours now too.